I think that was the first time where the light bulb went off, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, we can weave everything that we're doing with this community sponsorship," because they put together packages. But even in speaking with them, they were saying a lot of their sponsors would just treat them as like one-offs. Cool, we have an event. Cool, we're going to do a survey. Cool, we're going to do a Slack channel takeover. And what we started to do was try and weave all of these assets, or whatever we want to call them, things that were given up with this community sponsorship, and almost create a narrative.
Hey everyone, I'm Joel Premack, host of the Community-Led Growth Show. Today I'm joined by Arthur Castillo, head of Dark Social and Evangelism at Chili Piper. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Arthur.
This is going to be exciting, Joel. A long time coming, so I'm excited we can finally do this.
I am equally excited. So we're just gonna cut right to it. Give everyone a quick 30-second intro so we can get to the meat of today's conversation.
Let's do it. So, as Joel said, Arthur Castillo, I work at Chili Piper. I actually was in sales for about 7 to 8 years before I switched over to the dark side of marketing. So, created our field marketing team kind of from scratch, from the ground up. That eventually led to integrating our field marketing efforts with community. And now still involved a little bit in field marketing, but my title, as you mentioned, is head of dark social and evangelism. So I get to work across our communities, across our customer advisory board, and look for opportunities to either create content with our champions, shareable content that we hope that they feel proud of sharing within their network and their communities, and really just trying to give our customers that evangelize our customers really, and give them the spotlight rather than putting all the spotlight on Chili Piper, sing the praises of our customers.
Love it. So we're gonna go right into it. I'm so excited to have today's conversation because I think that there are a handful of companies that have done what Chili Piper has done exceptionally well. And it is essentially sponsoring third-party communities
Mhm.
versus instead of building your own as your community strategy. So why did Chili Piper and you and the team decide to go this route?
Yeah. And this is really cool because it's leading up to kind of where we're at now. But I will shout out Dan Smalia. He was the one that actually got brought on, and one of his goals was really to start a Chili Piper community. And he pushed back on that and said, "Look, community was the flavor of the month. Everybody was trying to start a community. There was enough out there that we wanted to take this position of, hey, what if we supported the communities that are important to us, and really looked at this cross community evangelism play where we played nice with a lot of these communities. And in return, they would kind of help us build our audience." So I think that was probably one of the biggest things at the time. We had a pretty small social following. We didn't feel like we had a big enough email list to really start hosting our own digital events. So we went this route of, hey, why don't we sponsor third-party communities, the ones that are active, the ones that relate to our personas, see what that looks like. And at the time, I feel like it was still so early on where community sponsorships was really just starting, that we had a lot of lessons learned. And I feel like we kind of took this almost spray and pray approach with communities and said, okay, we know they speak to this certain use case or this persona. Why don't we sponsor them, see how it works out? And then come renewal, we can kind of evaluate. So I think the main thing was just us understanding where we were at as a company, knowing that we did need a little bit more help to build our own audience. So we went the route of sponsoring third-party communities versus starting our own.
Cool. So now that we've set the stage with that backstory, essentially, I'm really curious, you kind of mentioned this around personas and problems and things of that nature that were commonly discussed within the communities, but were there any more strict criteria that you all kind of had in mind when thinking, hey, these are even in the realm of possibility, versus this just being no, this is just not okay or acceptable for us?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm trying to think, at the beginning, we probably did sponsor a lot of the communities that people are familiar with in B2B SaaS. But we're also unique in that we do have kind of specific personas that we can sell to. We have a sales use case. RevOps often gets involved. Any ops gets involved in our deals. And then our flagship use case is really marketing. We even have like a CS use case, which isn't prominently used. So we didn't tap into that market, but we knew a good amount of where our revenue came from was the marketing use case and the sales use case. So that was kind of, okay, communities that focus on revenue leaders, sales, marketing, ops. That was what we started to look at. I think from there, we also we wanted to see how engaged these members were within these communities. So one of the things we look for is it like the admins kind of starting the discussion, or was there discussion amongst community members where they were asking questions, they were helping each other out. Responses per thread was another thing we kind of looked at to gauge that engagement of like, okay, yeah, this is a community that's led by its members versus led by its admins and its leaders. I think one of the biggest things, and maybe this became more clear as we came up for renewals and things like that, was how willing they were to lean into our own initiatives. We really wanted to create win-win situations where, let's say if membership growth was a huge focus of theirs, we would offer some of that of like, hey, maybe we send out an email send, or any events that we do, we can share a list of attendees. And if there's people you would want us to invite to your community, we're happy to do that. There's even communities where they did have a paid membership and we were willing to like pay for people's annual memberships as a way to kind of create that two-way win-win relationship between us sponsoring, but also knowing what was important to them, which really helped us because I think a lot of it was like, one, understanding what's important to the community, but two, how do we maybe link that to certain initiatives that we're working on so we can take more of this integrated approach. So I guess to recap, yeah, personas, mainly sales and marketing, engagement amongst members versus like admin driven engagement, and then how willing they were to lean into some of our initiatives and really make it a two-way relationship and try and create win-win situations.
I love that last one of learning the goals of each other,
Yeah.
because I think very often sponsors and communities can be very siloed in their own perspective, especially when you're talking about like a renewal. Like a renewal is just like any other vendor that you engage with, whether it's tech, service, etc. So I think instead of like being very dug in your trenches and like digging your heels in, I think it's really great that you all took the approach of like, hey, we're seeing value, you're seeing value. That's like the initial checkbox. Let's have a more meaningful discussion around like how our goals align for the next year, and like ways we can support each other. Because like the more we support each other, the happier we all are together.
Bingo, right? Like I think a lot of people look at it as like, hey, we're cutting you a check and you're at our beck and call, or like, okay, cool. You have to make sure every event or whatever email blast or Slack blast is like getting us something. But I don't know if that came from more of like maybe the sales background of seek to understand before being understood, and saying like, hey, what is important to you as we're growing our audience? How can we push back into some of your initiatives that you're doing? Is it providing opportunities to like be a speaker or a host for some of your events? Whatever it was important to them. I know some of them like even saw us as an extension of their community for some of our in-person events that we were putting on, and that was important to them. Like, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, I think it really is like seek to understand before being understood.
So now that we covered that, I'm really curious, like you obviously mentioned that you like to see engagement.
Yes.
So within the community, but now I'm a little bit more curious around like you all engaging with members of a third party community. Like, were there specific rules of engagement? What were some of the ways that you all found success? And what were some ways that you commonly saw that like were not allowed, or you had to talk to members of the Chili Piper team about like this not being okay, if any at all?
Yeah. I like this question. It forces me to be pretty introspective. And to me, I think it'd be cool to talk about even like the evolution of how we looked at community sponsorships. So I think we were one of probably the first B2B tech companies that really leaned into this. I know a lot of these communities will say that we were one of the first official sponsors. And because of that, I think so many people were learning and they were almost giving us like, this is the package. This is what we're going to fulfill for you. And we're like, cool, let's see what happens from this. Couple of events, couple of mentions in like their Slack channels, announcements, things like that. But I think over time, what we realized was tracking that, but almost creating an integrated marketing approach within our own sponsorship. So let me give you an example. MoPros, marketingops.com now, they, I think that was the first time where the light bulb went off and I was like, oh my gosh, we can weave everything that we're doing with this community sponsorship, because they put together packages. But even in speaking with them, they were saying a lot of their sponsors would just treat them as like one-offs. Cool, we have an event. Cool, we're going to do a survey. Cool, we're going to do a Slack channel takeover. And what we started to do was try and weave all of these assets or whatever we want to call them, things that we're given up with this community sponsorship, and almost create a narrative. So the one was we got two events. We were going to do a survey, and then we did a Slack channel takeover. So we began the Slack channel takeover in line with our first event, and a way to promote that even within their own community, right? Hey, we have this event coming up, Slack channel takeover. So we're kind of listing things, even dropping certain articles that we thought was relative to the topic that we're going to present on. And then using that, we wanted to dig in and actually promote the survey that we were doing with the marketing operations pros. At the same time, Slack channel takeover is still happening. So we're kind of telling people, hey, this is the replay. Hey, this is the survey we're doing. And then our second event was actually almost like a Zoom tell-all Q&A about the survey results. So we'd say, hey, we found this really interesting. What do your members think of it? And that was when the light bulb clicked for me of like, okay, it's not just like we get this one thing from them, we get another thing. How do we actually weave all of these things together to make sure we're like creating more awareness, branding around our efforts, and they could kind of see where we're getting at, whether it's the problems we solve, whether we were highlighting things that maybe were top of mind for them and getting other people together to come up with different suggestions, share challenges. So that was really cool. And it was cool to even hear the founders' response to how we were thinking about it, because they were like, yeah, everybody looks at this as one off. I really like how you guys have integrated it. And I think we took that blueprint and then started to try and do it across other communities of like, okay, how do we not just do one-off campaigns or events together? How do we weave this narrative so that your members are pretty familiar with our brand, but also what we do and maybe ways in which we can help? So I guess that's like one way we look to engage them. I know your other question was around like rules that we couldn't or things like that, or
Yeah, yeah. Like if there were certain things that like you all routinely saw that members, whether of Chili Piper or
yeah.
you specifically, like couldn't do within communities or when you were engaging with members at community events, for example.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think most of them have this ethos of, hey, let's bring value. Let's not just make it another pitch slap or look for opportunities to sell to each other, which honestly, that was never our play. We like that's just such short-term thinking. And we knew why people joined these communities. It wasn't to find out about new tools, or if it was from their peers. So that was another strategy we actually tried to implement, was understand who were our champions within that community. Some of these communities even like gave us a history of their Slack channels whenever Chili Piper was mentioned, so we could one determine if it was a good community for us to invest in, because we're like, oh, it's coming up a lot, or there's a lot of questions, a lot of good feedback. But I think it was just as important to see who was engaging in those threads, and then we would reach out to them and say, hey, are you comfortable with us tagging you? Because it just sounds like defensive if somebody's maybe saying, hey, I had a bad experience with your product, and you're saying, hey, no, we actually do that. Or it just came across much better if it was like a peer saying, hey, no, this
Mhm.
is actually how I used it. And maybe you're not using it in the right way because I've never come across that issue. So that was another way we tried to identify our champions to engage with members and really tag them in threads that we thought were relevant. Um, but yeah, I think the biggest thing was like you can't pitch directly, which never was part of our strategy. We knew people wanted to go there to learn from their peers, gain value, gain insights, speak about challenges, speak about opportunities. It wasn't about like, oh, this is a great place for us to like go in. Um, I'll mention another thing because I think this is pretty interesting from a community perspective, almost like a retention churn play. A lot of the times we looked at it and we could see people were complaining or they were saying, hey, is there any alternatives to this tool? And sometimes I would take a screenshot of that, look for the account manager or the CSM and say, hey, by the way, heads up, looks like you might be coming across an interesting conversation come renewal time. So trying to find ways in which we could get ahead of it, find ways in which we could have our peers educate them or maybe reach out and say, hey, I don't know if you're having issues with this, but we'd love to teach you how some of our other customers are doing it. So that was kind of cool too when we would see and we would search by keywords of like scheduling or chili pipe or whatever it was to understand if some of our clients were even looking for alternatives and how we could get ahead of that.
So I really like something that you said earlier about how some of the communities that you engaged with would sometimes show you or grant you access to mentions of Chili Piper so you all could see it. When you were looking at communities, did you ever actually check more or less to see if competitors were coming up and say like, hey, Chili Piper's not coming up, but our competitors are, and that's why we went after a community?
Interesting. I don't think we did. Now that I think about it, I don't know if it wasn't like top of mind or if it was still because communities were so brand new. But it wasn't something that we looked into whether like our competitors were being mentioned. I'm trying to think now. Maybe there was a case because I know we did ask for like exclusivity amongst this one community. And I don't know if that was preemptive, thinking like, hey, they're going to come in here eventually and want
Mhm.
to like take up this space, or if we kind of knew that they were being mentioned a little bit and saying like, okay, let's try and put a little bit of a moat around whether or not they can kind of
Yeah,
engage or at least sponsor some of these events. So really, it was only one community that I believe we might have done that, but I can't tell you if it was like a preemptive defensive technique
yeah,
or we kind of saw, hey, our competitors are being mentioned here. Let's ask for exclusivity.
fair. No, just a question. I was like, I wonder if this scenario ever came up. So cool. Um, it's interesting to me what I'm about to ask because I worked at a community where it was essentially the product previously.
Mm,
So I have many thoughts on this from my time being on the other side of the table. But as coming from the side of being at a company that's sponsoring a community, how did you all show ROI for this community programmatic strategy of sponsoring third party communities versus it being a little bit more clear from time to time when you have your own?
yeah. And there's definitely like an evolution of this as well. I think our marketing team was always tied to our number one KPI is qualified held metrics. And then we track qualified pipeline and close one revenue. So it's interesting because I think a lot of these communities, and maybe this is just a state of marketing, realize that like lead sharing and giving you leads from their events was maybe valuable to some people. And we didn't really look at it that way. At the time, we weren't even passing leads off to our SDRs. That was another decision that we kind of made. But it always felt weird. Like you can tell how other marketers' KPIs are like almost clouding the way these communities would go about sponsorships because they're like, hey, you're going to get 10,000 leads across the duration of our sponsorship. And I don't know if they were expecting us to be like, oh my gosh, we're like, cool. I don't think we're going to do anything with those. Um, so really it came down to demos or qualified held meetings. That was like our number one. Um, but at the time, I don't think we had our data team set up, and I'll talk about how they've really like helped us understand the ROI of these communities. So it really was almost like a good hypothesis of, hey, we know our ICP is within this community. Maybe like if we didn't get qualified held meetings, at least we knew there was some sort of brand awareness that we were creating within these communities. But of course, that's not great ROI. So I think like that's when we slowly started to understand, okay, which ones maybe were driving qualified held meetings, which ones weren't at all, which ones got a lot of their attendees to join some of our webinars and events, our co-sponsored events together. That started to become a little bit more evident where some would drive hundreds and some would drive maybe 20 or 30. And it's like, okay, this isn't really what we were looking for. But then it really became about how willing were they in terms of leaning into our own initiatives. And that's where I think our community-led growth strategy started to change, because now it wasn't about like, hey, what do we get out of sponsoring this community in terms of events or access to lead lists? It's like, how do we create this win-win situation where it's like, okay, we know it's important to you. Social media was huge for us. So then we're like trying to identify, hey, which communities are helping us amplify some of our messages and would join in on some of our announcements. Which ones were helping us out with some of our own events in terms of using it as an extension of their community to offer in-person events. And now I'll transition to, I guess, once our data team was in place. So once we had that, then we could actually track based on the events that they attended from a community. We created a campaign in Salesforce. And then by clicking into that campaign, it would kind of track the buyer's journey. And at least it didn't have to be direct attribution, which is a whole nother story. We were direct last touch attribution at one point. But could we at least say with some certainty, hey, the people that we're trying to sell to are in this community? And maybe they attended an event 3-4 months ago, but then we started to track that through the campaign by seeing, one, is qualified pipeline being created, and then 2, closed won revenue. So that really helped us solidify and kind of validate this hypothesis of, hey, we think our ICP is in here, but is it leading to pipeline being created? In some cases it was, in some cases it wasn't.
Fair enough. That's when renewal conversations have to happen.
Exactly, right?
Yep. So obviously you all have been doing this for a few years now as your strategy. So what are just like some learnings or best practices that you'd like to share with other companies that are evaluating this community approach essentially with third-party relationships and like third-party communities?
Yeah, I think probably some of the things I mentioned already, right? Of how often is your brand being mentioned? How often, maybe now that you gave me a really good idea, are your competitors being mentioned? Responses per thread, right? Different things like that. Is it coming from the members themselves or is it coming from the admins? But I think the biggest piece of advice, and maybe communities are going to hate me for saying this, is it's a two-way street. And they might present a sponsorship package to you, but that's not the only thing that you should kind of look at and say, okay, this is all we get from our community sponsorship. I think if you take the approach of seek to understand before being understood, understand what's important to them, and trying to identify maybe some initiatives that you're working on that you can say, hey, that's really cool because I think this ties in nicely with this, and we'd be happy to invite members, pay for membership fees of certain people. So I think understanding that you can negotiate some of these sponsorship agreements and look at it from an integrated marketing approach. Don't just do these one-off events, one-off campaigns that don't tie back to maybe a larger picture or other events that you're doing. Try and create this continuous journey, continuous funnel where you can invite them back, or you said, hey, you attended this, I think you'd love this live Q&A that we're doing, or hey, this seems to be very top of mind for you. You should check out this little piece of infographic or article that we did. So that would probably be my biggest piece of advice, of look for those opportunities to create win-win situations, and don't be afraid to negotiate kind of what they offer you out of the box.
I would definitely agree with that. I think on both sides, people don't ask for necessarily what they want, either want to give or want to get. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially from the companies that I've seen do this exceptionally well and hear from like colleagues in the space who have taken this approach. It's often some of the things that they aren't included typically in packages that sometimes have the biggest impact for them, or saying like,
Yeah.
oh, we want more of these, say, events. We don't care so much about a, for example, channel takeover, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like at first I kind of felt bad sharing like, hey, don't feel maybe like communities are going to hate me because I'm saying to negotiate. But now that I think about it, it actually does create even like good conversations for renewals because you're laying your cards on the table saying this is what's important to me and this is how I'm also measuring our investment with your community. Also, I want to learn what's important to you. So I think it just creates longer term relationships versus like what can you get out of these communities. So I take that back. I don't feel bad. Negotiate all the way.
Yes. See, making you not feel bad. That's a goal for this Friday. Happy to make you feel better, Arthur.
Love it.
As we are coming up on time, what are your three community trends for B2B SaaS that you're watching and looking out for in 2023 and beyond?
Okay. Okay. Here we go. Coming in hot with this one. I
Yes.
think that communities that focus on career advancement and career development are the ones that are going to survive. I think, given the economic situation that we're all in, looming recession, budgets being cut everywhere, a lot of these community models are based off sponsorship. And I can see a lot of companies starting to pull back those sponsorship dollars. One, because maybe it wasn't clear on the ROI, and two, simply because they have to, because a lot of budgets have been cut. So I think those communities that really focus on kind of career development and advancement, that's what people keep coming back to. That's where they know, hey, if I invest in this community, it's actually going to come out the other side. Um, which kind of leads me to like maybe we're going to see a lot of acquisitions around these communities because I don't know if they're going to be sustainable. A lot of them have now started to even have employees. And if their only business model is sponsorship revenue, I think where you might start to see this acquisition of communities if you sell to a certain persona, maybe you're trying to go bottom up. I think that's going to happen. So that's probably number one. Number two, and I don't know, I'm probably looking at it through a biased lens, but just based on the reception we got through sponsoring a lot of communities, I think there's an appetite to create more in person events. So I think a lot of these communities were birthed during the pandemic. We're just looking for a way to communicate with our peers, and they really served its purpose. And not to say that they still can't, but I think it's losing a little bit of the novelty, and people want to have those deeper relationships. And I think it's tough to have those unless you are face to face. So I think, and I hope a lot of these communities are going to start to create maybe meetups in person, areas in which there's a lot of members that are geographically concentrated. I think you'll start to see more of these meetups happen in person. And I guess number three, kind of related to point number one, I think you're going to start to see more customer communities being a big focus in 2023. I think marketing budgets being cut and maybe sponsorship of communities. I know that's one thing we're now looking into of like customer marketing is going to be huge for us, right? So maybe how do we create not necessarily even communities, but just spaces for some of our customers to meet and share those playbooks. And I know you and the team at Lattice do an incredible job of this. I think that a lot of companies can learn from what you guys have done and what you have built. And of course, this is kind of going down the route of organic social and owning your own audience versus renting out other communities. So those are my three predictions for communities in 2023.
Hey, I love them. Thank you for the latest shout out. Always appreciate it. Um, I definitely would agree that I think some communities are going to die. I think it's just oversaturated, especially in, I'll say, the broader space of general go to market.
Yeah.
I think every subgroup almost within go-to-market has a space.
Yeah.
And it's just not sustainable for someone to be active in so many smaller spaces.
Yeah.
And then with that, it's not just you're taking away people's time, but you're also potentially taking away, as you were kind of pointing out, like budget, whether it's community's budget for employees, whether it's sponsorship budgets because they maybe sponsor 8, maybe next year they can only afford 4.
Yeah.
Who are they dropping? Who knows? So I think it's going to force, as you said, some real hard discussions. And it might be on the rise then for more companies to buy communities.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
knows? Only time will tell.
Exactly.
Well, Arthur, again, thank you so much for being on the Community-Led Growth Show today. If people want to follow and or connect with you after watching/listening to the episode, what are the best channels and or handles for them to use?
Yeah. I know you're big on Twitter, so I do have a Twitter handle. The Startup SDR created it probably when I joined tech, so it's cool to see that that handle still happen. But I'm definitely the most active on LinkedIn, and that's probably where I create the most content as well. So if any of these ideas, these predictions gave you some food for thought, feel free to reach out, connect. Love to have these community chats and see what's in store for us in 2023.
Amazing. Thank you so much and have a great day, Arthur.
Thanks, Joel.